All right, excellent. Well, I'm Matt Church from the Berkley Library. I'd like to thank you all for being here tonight. We're excited to have Wayne State Professor Kevin Deegan-Krause here with us and RankMIVote. They approached us to give an informative and nonpartisan discussion, and we were certainly happy to host them and have them here. So I'll turn it over to Kevin now.
Well, thank you so much, and I have to say I'm always appreciative of the Berkley Library for many reasons, but one reason in particular is that many years ago I served on the Ferndale Library Board, and when I did, and we sought to upgrade our library from what was a very classic 50s library that had stayed in the 1950s to something more modern. When we did that, we looked to Berkeley for how to do our interior renovation, how to organize boards, and so on. And so it's always a pleasure to go back to your library, and it's always it's a delight to know that we've managed to somehow get into that same ballpark as all of you and bring our libraries into the 21st century. So thank you for that gift from long ago.
Yes, that's wonderful. Thank you.
And let me just introduce myself. My name is Kevin Deegan-Krause. I was introduced as a Wayne State University professor, but really I'm a citizen, occasional library board member, lover of libraries, and I'm somebody who spends a lot of time thinking about democracy and thinking about elections. That's actually my job at Wayne. I get to teach 18 to 21-year-olds about things that are really important. I think it's the best job anyone could ever ask for. And as part of that, I've had the chance to do quite a bit of going abroad. My study is really other countries' democracies. And in the process, I discovered that there were other countries that did elections differently than we do. I probably should have known that, but it took me a lot of experience to see it. And I came back to my own country thinking that if I ever got an opportunity to make some of those innovations, to bring some of those about that helped other countries do their democracies well, that I would jump at the chance. And so a couple of years ago, when a group started to work to get rid of gerrymandering, that was something that I felt I had to be a part of. And then when that was accomplished, and we're still in process, and another group, RankMIVote, said that they were going to work on ranked choice voting, I thought this is something that I really need to be a part of. And so I feel really fortunate to be part of this group, RankMIVote, and to do some presentations on the thing that we are looking to create. And that is a subtle but important change in Michigan's electoral system that would allow you, instead of just saying which candidate you like and ignoring all the others, to rank your vote. That's what we are. We're a 501c3. And that's what we are seeking to do for the municipalities of Michigan and for the state itself. But let me stop for a second and ask all of you, you're all sharing your evening, beautiful evening with us. I'm wondering what brings you here? What have you heard about ranked choice voting, or what would you like to hear from me as we talk? Feel free to unmute yourself.
Oh, I guess I'll go first.
Okay.
I have a lot of experience with ranked choice. Every year I vote on the Hugo Awards, which are the science fiction Oscar. And that's the system we use. And we know it as the Australian ballot. But been voting that way for 40 years now.
Trust the science fiction fans to do this. Tom, we need to have a separate talk because, you know, we have a science fiction book club at the Ferndale Library, and we would love to have you if you'd be interested. Okay. But we can talk about that separately. But absolutely, the Oscars do this. The Hugo Awards for science fiction do this. Hundreds of universities use this for their student senates. Lots of corporations use this for their corporate boards and so on. So you're absolutely right. It's all around us. We just don't think a lot about it. Have you been satisfied with the way it's worked for the Hugos?
Generally, there was one case of vote rigging about 5 years ago, but that's a whole different story.
That's right, and that had more to do with the way that the organization was structured as a membership organization rather than the other way.
Yeah, kind of.
The other way around.
There was a block, and I'm not sure there's any way against in any system on that.
Absolutely. Anybody else? Anything else that you've heard about or want to know about ranked choice voting?
I don't know what it is.
All right, then let me start there. So Jessica, it is a change in our electoral system. And I'll run through what it is. I want to start actually by thinking about maybe why we would even think about changing our electoral system. Why would we change, how we go from counting the votes to who gets elected? So this is really what I want to talk about. So I want to show how the current system works, or really technically how it doesn't work. I want to show how ranked choice works. So to give you a sense of this is what ranked choice is. Show how it actually then solves those problems that we're facing, and then talk a little bit about what RankMIVote is doing to get it in Michigan. So that's going to be the big thing. I'm going to talk for about 25 minutes maybe, and then we can have a full discussion. And we have a small enough group. Feel free to stop me if you've got questions or thoughts, because if you're anything like me, by the time you get to the end of a presentation, you've forgotten the question that you had in the middle. So feel free to stop at any time. So the first thing that I want to say, I've done about 50 of these across the state during the pandemic. Actually, I did about 10 of them before the pandemic physically. And I encounter people all the time who look at the democracy and say that there are problems with it. And there are all sorts of different problems. But one of the problems that people say is that they feel like when they get into the voting booth, they have to make a really horrible choice. It's a choice, the candidate that they really want, and the candidate they feel like they're told to vote for, or the candidate they feel like they have to vote for to prevent the worst case scenario. And so America's system creates a kind of dilemma between voting for your heart and voting with your rational calculation. And sometimes those two things aren't the same. And so you hear a lot about them. I'm sure you've heard these phrases like, America is a system of voting for the lesser evil. People say, oh, you're just going to waste your vote, or just hold your nose and vote for the candidate who's, the best alternative to the candidate you don't like, but maybe not the one that you want. And these are all natural because the way Americans vote in our winner-take-all system, they lend themselves to that kind of calculation. That kind of calculation is really natural. You're not doing anything wrong when you do that. What's wrong is the system that makes you do that. And what I would tell you is that there is a simple way to organize democracy that actually allows you to first vote your heart and then a second choice, a ranked choice, then to vote rational calculation, so that you can vote your passion, but you can also vote common sense just in case the vote of your passion doesn't make it in. And you're not going to contribute to the election of the worst case scenario, the one on the far other end. And so that's really what ranked choice voting is. But for a lot of people, when I talk to them about it, they don't realize that kind of thing is possible. It's like living in a house with a leaky roof all your life and not realizing that you don't need the buckets that are on the floor to gather the water, because you could actually just fix the roof. And that's really what we're saying. We can just fix the roof on this without a lot of problems. The second related question is something that we call the majority problem. And more precisely, it's the fact that you actually don't need a majority to win an election in the United States. We talk about majority rule, but actually in the United States, what we have is winner take all. And that means just more than anybody else. And that raises all sorts of problems, because you would look at a situation like this and you probably have a guess which side should actually win this election. And if there's only one candidate for each side, then it's going to come out that way. But if there's more than one candidate on any given side, and oftentimes it's the big, most popular side that produces the most excitement, that produces the most candidates. If there are more candidates on that purple side, it is entirely possible that they split the vote in such a way that the 30% share, the orange slice over there, that they win. And then that creates further problems, because those other two candidates, who all they wanted to do was express themselves to be candidates for office, they get accused of having wrecked it for the purple overall. They get accused of being spoilers. So this is the problem with America's electoral system right now. We can't control who runs. And if more people run on a given side, they actually end up hurting that side. So we end up with this kind of paradoxical situation that the side that has the most enthusiastic candidates, the largest number of enthusiastic people running for office, often loses because they split that vote up. And so this really is a problem. And we sometimes call it the spoiler problem, but the last presentation that I did like this in person, just before the pandemic hit, I did in the city of Troy. And I asked them, so who's the spoiler in this situation, expecting to start a discussion about who the spoiler would be. And Trevor got up in the back and said, I don't think any of them is the spoiler. I think the system is the spoiler. And it was especially amazing because Trevor is 10. Actually, he's probably now 11. He was 10 years old and he saw this. And if a 10-year-old can see this, I think we should probably be able to see it as well. So there are these two big problems with the way that America votes, and they make people really frustrated, but they make people frustrated in a way that they often don't even sort of realize. It's sort of a nagging frustration in the back of their minds because they don't realize there's a way out of the situation. So that's actually what I want to talk to you about. So the thing that I want to show you is what that actually looks like, and that thing is ranked choice voting. So ranked choice voting is a way of gathering more information than we do now, and then using that information to determine a winner who has a broader support than the winners do now. But it's built on the same basic infrastructure. So you don't have to learn anything new. You just have to learn to do one additional thing. So here's a standard ballot, thanks to the League of Women Voters, which does an amazing job producing these sample ballots. And in American political life right now, we get the ballot, we get candidate A, B, and C, we vote for the candidate we like the most, and then we stop. But I would argue that that's probably not all we can do. That almost every one of us, when we see 3 or 4 or 20, like in the most recent Democratic presidential election, when we see those candidates, we rank those candidates in our head. We don't just like one and hate all the rest. We like one, and then there's another one we like almost as much, and there's another one that's pretty good, and there's another one that's, we can rank the people in our heads according to how much we like them. And so what ranked choice voting does is to take advantage of the fact that your brain is constantly working, whether it's politics or ice cream or Netflix, we constantly have these ranks in mind. And we don't in any other realm of life go into a store and say, well, they don't have the flavor of ice cream that I like, I'm just gonna leave. No, we pick a different kind of ice cream. We go to a second choice. Or if we go on Netflix, if they don't have the show we want, we don't just turn it off. We go to the next show that we want on our queue, and so on. So what ranked choice voting does is it gives us a place to say what's our additional preferences. So in this case, what we do is we treat the first column as not the only choice, but as the first choice. So same procedure, same exact procedure. We take that first column, we fill in the candidate we like the most. And if that's all that you like, or if you're running out of time, you can stop there. But what ranked choice voting allows is it adds additional columns for a second choice, for a third choice, for as many choices as you want. So first column gets your first choice, second column gets your second choice, third column gets your third choice, and so on. And that's it. And you can, if you want, you can just fill out the first column. But you don't have to, because you can add that additional information that's in your brain that we might as well use so that we can get candidates who have a majority and stop the spoiler problem. So that's the method of voting. It looks very similar. People rarely have any problem with it. They simply get an additional column for every preference, and they don't have to use it if they don't want to. But it turns out most people do use it. About 80, 90% of people at least often use those additional. The other part about ranked choice voting that's pretty effective is that it gives a mechanism for counting those. So now that we've asked you what your first and second and third choice is, we need to actually incorporate that into the decision-making process. And so I actually want to use an example from the state of Maine. So Maine has been doing this now for 2 election cycles. It's one of 2 states in the country that uses this for its elections. So I want to just show an example, the real numbers from the 2nd district in Maine, which provides a good example of how this works. So this election had 4 candidates, it had 2 independents, it had a Democrat, and it had a Republican. And when we look at the results look pretty normal, pretty much like an ordinary American election. We had, one candidate here get 134,000 votes, another candidate get 132,000, so pretty close. And then we had 2 independent candidates, one of whom got 16,000 and the other who got 7,000. You can actually notice already a slight difference. Most American elections, you don't get the independent candidates winning that many votes. And so something else is different here. And the difference is that the voters in this election know that their votes aren't going to get wasted, that they can vote for Tiffany or Will without somehow enabling the vote of the person they like the least. The other thing to note here is that Bruce Poliquin, though he got 134,000 votes, 2,000 more than his next door opponent, he didn't get a majority. He got considerably less, about 10,000 votes less than a majority. And if you don't get a majority, that could easily mean that these other candidates have just split a vote but that these are anybody but Bruce voters. And so what we need to do is we need to find out, well, what do those other voters, what other candidates do those other voters like? And so the mechanism of ranked choice voting is really simple. What we do is we start with the candidate who has the least chance of winning, so the candidate who has the fewest first place votes, and we simply act as if that candidate hadn't run. And so we look at who that candidate's voters would have voted for if that candidate hadn't run. In other words, we look at their second choice column. So we actually take Will's votes, we look at them and we see that a bunch of those were for Tiffany, a few of them were for Bruce, a few of them were for Jared. And so we actually, because we know that, we can actually physically redistribute the ballots, and we can actually do ranked choice voting using physical ballots. But we actually move those ballots over. We can also do it electronically. And then we recount. So now Will's votes have been redistributed to the people who they would have voted for if he hadn't run. And we see that Tiffany has moved up a little bit. She's up to 19,000, but she still hasn't gotten anywhere close to the others. And Bruce Poliquin still doesn't have a majority. In fact, he has less of a margin than he had before because Golden was the second most preferred among Will Hoare's voters. So we now do the same thing. Since no one's gotten a majority, we just look inside of Tiffany Bond's voters, and here's where we get the answer to that question that we had, which is this simply an anti-Bruce majority that's been split up into a number of different people? And it turns out it absolutely is, that more than half of Tiffany's voters actually prefer Jared Golden to anyone else, and about 4 times as many prefer Golden to Poliquin. And so when we redistribute those votes to the people they would have voted for, it turns out that Golden is the winner by a significant margin, because in fact, those 3 candidates had simply split up a voting block that would have voted purple if it hadn't been for the fact that all 3 had run. So that's the mechanism. That's the counting mechanism that we get with ranked choice voting. It's a simple way to deal with that additional information, and it produces the kinds of results that make sure that the majority side wins. And it makes sure that a candidate with a majority actually ends up winning. So the first thing it does is it solves this problem. It solves the lesser evil problem and the wasted vote problem. You know, in the past, if you had really liked Tiffany Bond and you wanted to vote for her, but you liked Jared Golden, just not as much, you might have really hesitated to vote for Tiffany Bond because, well, if you vote for Tiffany Bond, maybe Golden's going to come short and he's going to lose to Poliquin. In this new system, it's really simple. You vote for Tiffany Bond first, but you vote for Jared Golden second. And you know that if Tiffany isn't one of those main candidates, that Jared will be your second choice. Now, it may turn out that everybody's been sort of hiding their preferences. Everybody really likes Tiffany, but just no one would admit it because they know that the 2 dominant parties are the ones that they think are going to win. So sometimes it actually happens that the Tiffany Bonds of the world, when they're liberated by this, actually win. But if they don't, you know that the candidate you like next most is going to get your vote. And that frees people's minds. It lifts the weight, and it allows them to vote their heart first and to vote their rational calculation second. The second thing that it does is it gets rid of that spoiler problem. Because what happens when you do this? Well, in the current system, if Lavender and Mauve decide to run, they're going to split the purple vote up and purple's going to lose. In this system, both those are smaller percentages. They'll come in last. Probably most of their votes are going to get redistributed purple. And so purple is going to win, as the purple side should in an election like this. Orange should not be winning this election. And so ranked choice voting takes care of that spoiler problem as well. And it takes care of a few other sort of minor problems. And RankMIVote is not a partisan organization, but if you look at the partisan primary of the last election in 2020, or frankly, if you look at the Republican primary of 2016, primary elections with dozens, literally dozens of candidates, what we actually end up finding out is that there are so many candidates running that your vote almost becomes a crapshoot. It almost becomes a roulette wheel because so many candidates are running that it's possible for almost anybody to win. And it really depends on which candidates run against which other candidates, which candidates withdraw at what times. And so it's not so much about the right side winning as a kind of combination of accidents that determine who actually wins. Ranked choice voting actually does a really good job of solving that problem. because what it allows people to do is to vote for candidates that they don't think have a huge chance of winning, but it makes sure that if those candidates don't win, that your vote can then transfer to a candidate that you like more. And maybe if that candidate doesn't win, another candidate that you like as well. So to make sure that it goes to a candidate who ultimately has your allegiance, and so that your vote doesn't get thrown away and that the result isn't largely random. It's particularly important actually in Michigan because of the weird timing of our primary. Our ballots get printed really early, Republican or Democrat. They get printed in January before the primary starts. And people are voting in late February, early March to vote for that election on the 10th. And the fact that a lot of people these days vote absentee means a lot of those ballots have already been submitted. But in between that, lots of candidates have dropped out. And so if you were one of those, I know a bunch of my friends were, they voted for candidates who actually weren't even running by the time the election got there. Either they had to just forget about it and not worry that their votes weren't counting, or they had to go to the clerk to change their ballot, which was a rigorous process. The nice thing about ranked choice voting is that it actually takes care of that problem, because if you rank your vote, even if the candidate that you like has dropped out of the race, your vote will then shift to the next candidate that you like next most, and so on. So it'll solve that minor problem as well. And then there's a third little problem that it solves that I never thought I'd have to talk about, but we're increasingly seeing in America's sort of winner-take-all, no-holds-barred elections, we're seeing what are called ghost candidates. We're seeing candidates who will pay individuals with the same name as their opponent to run, especially in close races, so that those candidates actually split the vote. This happened 3 different times in Florida Senate election, just in the last 2020 election. And ranked choice voting has a really nice solution for that, because if there are 2 candidates with the same name and you don't quite remember which one is which, it's really easy to know that you vote for one of those 2 candidates first, and you vote for the other one second, and eventually all of those ballots will end up in the hands of the right candidate. So ranked choice voting gets rid of the incentive to do that really sort of nefarious intentional spoiler. It actually does some other kind of nice things as well. And you can imagine if you get rid of the spoiler problem and if you get rid of the wasted vote problem, you actually improve the tenor and quality of elections themselves and of the campaigns that happen before those elections. So one of our findings is that actually it changes how candidates campaign. You can think of a multi-candidate race these days. We've got 3 candidates running. If you've got a race that looks a little bit like this, and you're candidate A, you've got some really tough choices to make, because the candidate who's furthest from you, candidate C, you really don't like them. You don't want them to win. But you don't have much of an incentive to really go after their voters, because their voters are pretty far away. Their voters are sort of on the other side of the political spectrum. But candidate B's voters, those are the ones that you really have an incentive to go after, because those are the ones that are closest to you. Those are the ones that are potentially winnable, potentially wooable. And the only way to do that in the current system is to attack candidate B, to really go after candidate B as much as you can. But in ranked choice voting, it's not that you attack the candidate closest to you. In ranked choice voting, you actually have an incentive to say things like, I recognize that you like my opponent, candidate B, and I like my opponent, candidate B too. I think you should vote for me first and for her second. But if you really feel like you need to vote for her, please do that, but rank me second. And so it flips the calculus for those candidates. Instead of attacking the candidate closest to them, they actually have a good reason to be as nice to that candidate as possible, because there is still a chance of getting those voters second place votes, their second ranked votes in that second column. And this isn't just theory. It turns out that in cities where this has been adopted, and there are quite a few of them in the United States, that there are a variety of really good, reputable studies in what are called referee journals, the gold standard of political research, that finds that campaign civility in ranked choice voting systems is actually higher than it is in not ranked choice voting systems. And so when they compared 7 cities with to 7 very similar cities without, they actually found there was less negative campaigning. Voters were less dissatisfied and less unhappy because of that change in the relationship between candidates and the desire to actually speak well of neighboring candidates rather than to speak ill of them. And that makes a big difference. You can also imagine that a system like that increases satisfaction, even increases turnout. If you've gotten rid of the spoiler problem, if you've gotten rid of the wasted vote problem and people being afraid of not wanting to vote for a particular candidate, but not knowing what else to do, ranked choice voting actually solves that. And we've got some pretty good evidence that suggests that more people turn out and people are happier to turn out in those systems. And we find more representative results. And in practice, there are some really good studies, again, from those gold standard journals that say that when you use systems like ranked choice voting, what you end up getting are more candidates of color. You end up getting more women winning elections. So you get a group of candidates and a group of elected officials who more closely resemble the society as a whole. Largely because you've improved the tenor of those elections and you've reduced the barrier to candidates who maybe think they can't win, but under ranked choice voting think that they have a chance. So that's really the kind of big picture why we should switch to this. You might still be wondering, like, do we have proof that this really works? Well, there's a lot of evidence from different places. And we can start by going abroad and looking at the countries that have been doing this. So 5 countries in the world have been using this for quite some time. 3 significant countries have been using it for, in the case of Ireland and Malta, for over a century now. In Australia for coming up on 3/4 of a century. And then more recently, a kind of resurrection of it in places like Scotland and New Zealand. And you can look at this list. These are well-run countries. They're governed well. They have effective political systems. They had effective COVID responses. These are not places that are suffering in any way. These are places that use ranked choice voting and where ranked choice voting has actually contributed to the success of their polity. It's also used around the United States. It's not just something that's used abroad. So the state of Maine, as I mentioned, has been doing it since 2016. And Alaska actually just voted for it in 2020. So they'll use it for the first time in 2022. And then it's used in dozens of cities across the country. And what we see quite often are clusters of cities that use it. So there's a Massachusetts cluster, and there's a Minnesota cluster, and there's a California cluster. There's even a Colorado cluster and a Utah cluster. And you can see this isn't something that's a red state thing or a blue state thing. You got red states, blue states, purple states in between. Republicans in Utah love this. Democrats in Massachusetts love this. Cities all over the country use this. And it was on the ballot in 5 different cities in 2020, passed in all 5 of them. And an expansion of it was on the ballot in Portland, Maine, which has been using it for over a decade. And this for me is a really strong piece of evidence because Portland's been using it for their mayor since 2010. But Portland had the opportunity in 2020 to expand it to include not only the mayor, but the entire city council and the entire school board. And when they were faced with the choice of possibly expanding ranked choice voting, they voted for it by 81 to 19%. That says to me, when people see this in operation, they say, this works, I want more of it. I want it in more places. And we see the same thing. Bloomington and Minnetonka adopted after Minneapolis adopts it, and St. Paul adopts it after Minneapolis adopts it. You get San Francisco adopting it, and then Berkeley, and then Oakland, and then Palm Desert, and then Eureka, and so on. So this is what we're seeing, and we'd like to see that same development in the state of Michigan. We also see it used in a bunch of other places. So it gets used in a bunch of states that have runoff elections with their voters who are abroad. So people who are voting from other countries who are serving in the military. They actually get, for states like Arkansas and South Carolina, they get ranked choice voting ballots because there's no time to get those runoff ballots to them and back in time. So those voters get it. It's just that the rest of us don't get the opportunity. And then there are a variety of places like Kansas and Wyoming and Alaska and Hawaii, where this is used in Democratic primaries, in Utah, where this is used in Republican primaries. Utah's Republican governor, just passed a bill saying it was free to be used in cities across Utah. And as you've probably heard, New York is going to be using this for its mayoral election in the upcoming cycle. So this is our framework. This is what we think should be done, and this is what we've seen used successfully in a whole variety of other places. And so this is why we're trying to do it in Michigan. We're one of 28 different statewide organizations that are trying to make this happen. We work with them, we talk with them, we're each on our own, but we try and work to make this happen in all of those various places. And so our goal is really simple. It's to implement ranked choice voting in Michigan in 2 ways. The first is to get rid of the barriers that keep cities from using it. I just had a conversation with some people from the city clerk's office in Ferndale yesterday. Ferndale's had this on the books since 2004, but we haven't been able to use it. At first, we weren't able to use it because our voting machines weren't compatible with it. But in 2017, the state got new voting systems, and every single voting machine in the state will now work with ranked choice voting. But there is a dispute between within the State Board of Elections, a conflict that concerns the Secretary of State about whether using it requires changes in state law or whether it just requires changes in state procedure. And right now that's being disputed. What we'd like to do is to make sure that there is enabling legislation that, as in Minnesota, as in Colorado and California, allows any city that wants to use it, so that my Ferndale can start using it, so that Ann Arbor can start using it. And Ann Arbor now has a ranked choice majority, so it's likely they're going to put it on the ballot. Kalamazoo's been talking about this. Troy's been talking about this. Royal Oak has been talking about this. I wouldn't be surprised if there weren't some folks in Berkeley who are talking about this, because of the improvement that the system represents. The other thing we'd like to do is to do what Maine and Alaska have done, which is to get this introduced at the statewide level, so that the statewide races, governor and secretary of state, and all of those trusteeships and state board of education, that they could vote with ranked choice voting, and then our state house and our state senate and our representatives in Congress would be elected by ranked choice voting. Maine has done it. Maine's enjoyed it. The citizens of Maine have had a chance to repeal it. They haven't. They've chosen not to. And so we'd like to do the same. So that's the big picture. We're doing this. We're working with cities. We know that people have a lot more trust in this if they see it in operation. So we're trying to get that authorization so cities can actually use this. We're talking to various political parties about using this for their own internal decision-making process. So the Greens party already uses it for quite a few positions. The Libertarians are strongly considering it. And there's been really strong interest in the Democratic Party about using this for their own internal decision-making process. And we've been talking with the Republicans in Utah about talking to their counterparts here in Michigan as well. And we're working with voters. Eventually, to make at least the second part of this happen, we know we're going to have to go to voters, much like Voters Not Politicians did with their anti-gerrymandering resolution in 2018. We're still in the process of discerning what election would be best, whether that's going to be 2022 or 2024 or 2026. But we are working with individual voters to try and get them ready so that when it is time, we move this needle and we get this done. That's the big picture. If you're interested, I'd love to talk to you more about this from an organizational perspective. I want to respect the boundaries of the library and not do a sort of full-on fundraising pitch or anything like that. But if you're interested, there's lots of places you can volunteer. There's lots of places where you could, get more information from us. And if you want to leave your info in the chat, I'll grab that up. We promise to be very respectful with your information. We'll just send you a simple email asking you if you want other information from us. So you can do that or you can go to RankMIVote.org. And do the same thing. I just appreciate you giving me the time to be able to talk to you on this lovely evening. And I'm talked out, and you're listened out. And so I'm wondering if you've got any questions.
Yes, thank you for this wonderful presentation. And my question is, why is Ferndale having legal issues implementing this if there's already 3 other cities in Michigan that are doing it?
So you saw that map, and sometimes I sort of jump over that map because it actually turns out they're complicated. So there are 3 cities listed. One of those cities is Ann Arbor. Ann Arbor used it in the 70s when the laws about what cities could do with their elections weren't quite as restrictive. It worked in Ann Arbor. Ann Arbor elected during that time its first and to date only African-American mayor, but it was in a way a victim of its own success. And the people who were defeated in that ranked choice election in 1974 actually got together to put it on a low turnout school board election ballot and got it repealed in 1975 because they didn't want to have to deal with it. So it stayed off the ballot. It stayed off since then in Ann Arbor, but Ann Arbor wants to go back and do it. They would face the same difficulties that Ferndale does. The other place where it's being used right now is East Point. East Point is using it actually as part of the settlement of a court decision about prolonged segregation, prolonged discrimination in the East Point political system. In East Point, they have a significant African-American plurality in the city, but there have been no African-American elected officials up until the court decision. So the court worked with East Point to find a mutually acceptable solution, and what they finally ended up agreeing on was ranked choice voting. So it's always been nice for us to say, look, you know, if you're looking to solve injustice, where does the court turn to solve injustice? Well, it turns to ranked choice voting as a solution. The court decision overrode state law on this so that they could use it. But once the court order is vacated, once they've gone through that period, East Point will have a choice to keep it, but they will face those same limitations that Ferndale faces, Ann Arbor faces. So we want to get rid of those few kind of restrictions right now. It's not clear that we have any legal problems. It's simply that the State Board of Elections, which is very cautious about this kind of stuff, is interpreting state election law in a very, very restrictive way that a lot of lawyers say is simply not in keeping with what the law actually says. So that's where we're at right now. It may be as simple as getting the Board of Elections to take a look at this. There's a new head of that board. So we're trying to work with them. I know Ferndale's got some meetings with that person and then with the Secretary of State lined up to try and get this resolved as simply as possible. Any other questions? Yes, Tom.
Come on. Okay.
You got it.
Looking at ramifications, assume it went through. One thing I think would happen would be minor parties would benefit greatly from this.
Yes. That is, so what we've seen in a variety of places that have used this. So the example that I like to look at is Australia. Australia still does have a largely two-party system. So there are two fairly significant parties in Australia. But the smaller parties in Australia, the Green Party in particular, several kind of rural parties that focus on rural issues, those parties are stronger. And the reason they're stronger is that people can vote for those candidates without worrying about somehow shifting the political balance in line to the opposite party. They can donate more to those parties, knowing that those election campaigns will have a positive effect. Those candidates, because they get more preferences in public opinion polls, they get into debates, they get their voices heard to a greater degree. And so it doesn't seem in places like Australia to completely throw off the two-party system, but it does make it more permeable to those other voices, which are now either lost or sandwiched within the current two-party system. It would allow more votes for independents too. You know, right now an independent faces a huge challenge, especially at the local level. You know, people who are not one of the two kind of seemingly main candidates often don't feel like they have a chance. Sometimes all it takes is for them to run because people are looking for some fresh blood. But oftentimes without ranked choice voting, those candidates don't feel like they can afford to run, or they don't think that anyone will vote for them. You put in ranked choice voting and you actually change that and you get a little bit more circulation through the system.
You mentioned independence. We happened to be in Australia during a national election. Mm-hmm. And they wound up having what they call a hung parliament. The two main parties were 50-50 in representation. There were 3 independents who held the balance.
Yep.
And watching the machinery kind of grind and such was really interesting, at least for the foreigner. So
that's right. Now, part of it is that Australia has a parliamentary system that means that their executive gets picked by the legislature itself. So there the stakes are super high. But frankly, it's not that different in the United States when you see what happens, with a very narrowly split Congress, House, and Senate. And, I think there are lots of independent voices out there that right now get smothered. And so I think, having this kind of system, it's not that those voices aren't there right now, it's just that they're not listened to. So I think it's, relevant to have those folks in the system. I don't think you could imagine like a complete shakeup of the system, but you could imagine some additional voices being able to express themselves. They may not be voices that you agree with. Some of them might be voices you agree with a lot and others not so much, but those voices are there. And it probably does make sense to bring them into the system. Besides which, we get rid of this problem of having to worry about concealing who you want to vote for by voting for somebody else. My colleague Lisa Dish calls it insincere voting. And that's what our system raises us to do. It raises us to vote for the candidate we think can win rather than the candidate that we really want. That's not necessary. So that's where ranked choice voting comes in handy. Great question, thank you. Victoria. Oh, I'm sorry. Go.
Okay, thanks. I'm just curious, what type of comments do you hear from naysayers, and what are your remarks to those people?
So for a long time, the things that I would hear from naysayers were mainly, what the hell is that? I've never heard of such a thing. Like that was really, you know, for a long time. And I think even to this day, you know, the strongest opposition to this isn't opposition, it's just lack of awareness of this. Because most of the time when we talk it through with people, they say, oh, that makes a lot of sense. That actually could work. You know, there are some concerns. It does make things a little bit more complicated. You know, people are given more choices than they would have otherwise had. They have to, you know, they have those 3, 4, 5, 6 columns to fill in. And so, you know, there can be, for voters who take it seriously, a slightly higher load on them to actually learn about who they want second and who they want third and who they want fourth. On that stuff, there don't seem to be any really strong negatives in the sense that when we look at elections, one of the ways to tell if an election has gotten too complicated or problematic is how many people spoil their ballots. In other words, they overvote or they undervote and so on. And there are a number of different studies on this with ranked choice voting, and those studies either show one of two things. They show no change, so people get it, they figure out how to do it, it's not particularly problematic, or in a kind of worst case scenario, in the first election when it's introduced, there's an increase, you know, from like 1% to 3% in spoiled ballots, and then it drops back down to 1% in subsequent elections when people get the hang of it. So that doesn't seem to be a problem. The one thing that I think is worth considering, and so, you know, it's not an unalloyed good, is that in an era where people are increasingly questioning the election results, the validity of election results, it has to be said that the way of going from the voting to the results involves a certain amount of calculation, a certain amount of math. And there are some people for whom that's not a place that they would prefer to be, that you know, and where it you know, they want to cast doubt on the system. And so, you know, in the main case, for example, this case that I showed you, there were a bunch of people who just couldn't get it through their heads that, in fact, Bruce Poliquin was not the preferred candidate of the majority, because after all, he'd gotten the most first place votes, so why shouldn't he win? What's really interesting about that is that when we talked to the Republicans in Utah, they said, you know, we called Bruce Poliquin. We called him and said, you're going to have to run a different kind of campaign because you're going to have to reach out to independents and others. And he did not listen. He would not listen to them. So it takes people a while to adapt. And it can also, you know, it can give some people grounds for questioning the system. I think that's a serious critique, although the more I look at it, the same people who are going to question the system for that don't seem to find any problem questioning the system under the current system, which actually works pretty well with a lot of transparency. So I don't know that we're adding to the problem. I think we're just giving another, we're just giving another kind of arrow to people who've got a quiver, at least they think they have a quiver full of arrows to fire at the current electoral system. So what we have to do and what we vowed to do at RankMIVote is to make sure that everything we do has got to come, like it did with Voters Not Politicians, with an active educational effort to show people how this works and to show people, you know, why this system actually improves the quality rather than decreases the quality of democracy. So it's on us really to get the word out there, just like it was on Voters Not Politicians to do that with gerrymandering, which they kept doing and have done with, I think, real class and clarity. Anything, a couple of hands are raised, and I can't see which hands are raised on my screen, but go for it. Chris.
Okay. Hi, Kevin.
Hi.
I full disclosure, I am a volunteer with RankMIVote myself, and so definitely encourage anybody who's found this interesting and want to can like learn more or get active with it. Definitely email Jason. He put that in the chat. On top of that, though, this is something that I thought would be a good question to ask you, because I've kind of heard this a little bit. So what would you say to folks who would say, well, my local elections don't have the, the bipartisan, bickering awfulness that the national level politics have. So why do I need this in my city?
That's a great, Chris, are you in Berkeley?
Yes, I'm in Berkeley.
Yeah. If I'm not mistaken, Berkeley has the same system of Ferndale. They have a one-round election that's nonpartisan. Is that right? Mm-hmm. So no primaries, just a straight up one.
Yeah.
If Berkeley's anything like Ferndale, and I should know your system better, the reason we ended up passing this in Ferndale is we were seeing these systems. I mean, in some ways, the answer is that it is much more relevant in places like Berkeley and Ferndale than it is even at the national level. Because what we were seeing in Ferndale, from election to election, not every single one, was that, because it's nonpartisan, you don't have those identities. So, 1 year, 3, 4, 5 progressives decide to run, right? They split the vote and somebody else wins. Or 1 year, 3, 4 conservatives run, they split the vote and the other side wins. And that because there's no control over who runs in these elections, you actually end up being at the mercy of who decides to run. And it's the enthusiastic side, it's the one with all the candidates that ends up losing. In ranked choice voting, you get 4 conservatives to run. The conservatives rank the other conservatives close. And so it brings the vote total back around to like the number of conservatives in Berkeley. And you get the same number with the number of progressives in Berkeley. And so it's a much more sensible system because it doesn't produce that almost like random crapshoot effect of having multiple nonpartisan candidates when nobody's saying like, don't run this time. It's like, the other thing is, in a lot of cases, what happens in places like Berkeley, when it doesn't happen, it only happens because like the powers that be say like, don't you run. If you run, you're going to pay for this. Ranked choice voting lets those candidates run. It lets them get out there. Because that if they run, they're not going to hurt your chances on the same side. So there's a lot less of that arm twisting that I've seen happen in Ferndale, when you get 2 progressives running and, everyone gangs up on the least popular of the 2 to say, get out of the race or you're going to screw it up for all of us. So, leave that to the voters and leave it to the voters in the form of ranked choice.
Perfect. Thank you. Yeah. And yeah, I definitely feel like, from my perspective, it definitely is kind of a combatant for this kind of, we're going to keep all those other parties and those other people out of this election, and we're going to have all the control over it. So that's also something that I think about.
Absolutely. And, some of those parties are going to be parties that I don't like, and some of them are going to be parties I like a lot. But that's representative democracy. Like, that's what we're supposed to be doing. There was another hand up, but I don't see it at the moment.
Deb has her hand up.
Yes, Deb.
Yeah, hi. On one slide, I think you said there were 28 organizations that were working on ranked choice voting.
Yes.
And the map that you showed of the areas of the country that are using it was very informative, but I'm wondering about a timeline.
Yep.
Because I was surprised when you said it was 1970 that Ann Arbor, did it. So can you give us an idea of whether this has grown in the last 10 years or the last 5 years, this movement, or is it going to be a long time? And do we have to actually wait until 10-year-old Trevor comes of voting age to see this implemented?
I hope not. My goal, you've just given me a new goal. My goal is to make sure that Trevor can vote in a ranked choice voting election when Trevor votes. That's actually, you just given me the line for my every future presentation. That's a great question. When we did it in Ferndale in 2004, Deb, we were weird. Like the only people who had it at the time were Cambridge, San Leandro, San Francisco, and Berkeley, to my knowledge. That those are the only, and then Basalt and Carbondale, Colorado. Those are the only ones. So if you look at this map, and I don't have it here in timeline, which is a great idea, and you've given also me a good idea for slides. But if you look, what you see here actually is it's almost kind of exponential. It's sort of a snowball thing. And this is often what happens. I mean, this is what happens with, it happened with gerrymandering. It happens with other kind of innovations in good government. Is that, it gets used in a couple places. Other places see it and think, oh, we could do that too. And it really is interesting to me that, it didn't take long to go from Maine to Alaska. It took a long time to go from nowhere to Maine, but from Maine to Alaska, that was 4 years. And now, there are 28 different organizations. It's funny, when you asked me the question, I thought you have counted and there weren't 28 states highlighted. I was thinking, which one did I get wrong? But we've got all of these various states from all over the place that are committed to, to making this happen. So I think we're going to be able to do this before Trevor gets to vote, because I think it's a pretty simple common sense reform. We in Michigan have shown that we are capable of passing nonpartisan common sense reforms if they improve democracy. And this is one of those things. It's not the only thing we need to do. We could talk about other stuff that needs to happen. But I loved the fact that when Voters Not Politicians did it, they did a one simple, we're going to fix one problem and then we're going to move on to the next one. And that's actually something that I think could easily be done here. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. Yes. Thank you. And that's very encouraging. Thank you.
Someone else had a hand. I just saw it. And
yes, Dennis has his hand raised.
Yes, I'm wondering if anybody's tried to eliminate the primary and allowed more than one candidate from the same party. I understand that probably would end up with a bedsheet ballot, but have they tried that to save money?
Well, there is. So what's interesting is it hasn't been so much going away from primaries as modifying primaries. So one of the interesting innovations is the one in Alaska, and we're looking at it to see, I think part of it is we'd like to see this run once or twice, just like, with gerrymandering, we saw California do it successfully. So the Alaska solution is a really interesting one. It is an open primary, so no partisan, or you can run as a party, but it's an open primary with all parties, and then the top 4 candidates then go on to the general election in a ranked choice manner. So you can like you said, you can have a bed sheet in those primaries, although it's not going to be that different. It'll be maybe twice as big as a normal ballot. But you have a regular primary, and then the top 4 candidates, we end up doing ranked choice in the final in the final election. And someone pointed out, it's interesting that in Alaska, Senator Lisa Murkowski will be up in 2022, and that Murkowski has actually been a little bit more independent in the Senate, in large part because she's aware that through this new system, that she can't be forced out in the primary by a party that's at the extremes. And so that, even if that party, does run a candidate more to the extreme, she'll make it into that second round. And if she does, she's likely to pick up the second and third place votes of more moderates from the other side. And so it does seem in that case to be a more sensible way of doing primaries and general elections. I think we need to see it run through a couple tests, but I think it's the more I look at it, the more interesting it is. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Anything else? Tom. Oh, you're on mute, Tom. You're on mute.
Okay, sorry about that.
That's okay.
Murkowski's a special case because she was not chosen by her party and then ran a write-in.
Yep.
So she knows where it's like to be effectively an independent.
That's right. That's right. I mean, it is an interesting case, though, that, a candidate who is slightly more moderate than her party, sees in this the possibility to be a little bit more independent voice. because of the, because of what this allows. And when it works because a candidate is actually able to reach across the aisle. And I think that's what, when we can do that, we can find effective ways to do that. At least we're talking to one another, which is something that we're not doing enough of now. So I'm hopeful. I know, again, it's not the only thing that we need to fix, and it's not a magic bullet that is a perfect cure, but it is one of those ways of making a small but effective change that makes everything a little bit better. And then we just keep working. Like democracy is a constant. It's like owning a house, right? Something's always breaking. You got to go and fix it. I'm looking at my porch, so I got to go fix the porch when I'm done with this. But we got to go. We got to keep it. We got to keep the maintenance of it. We got to adopt the things that work, upgrade when necessary. And I think this is a good upgrade for our really not very functional winner-take-all system.
One more thing.
Yeah.
Ranked choice was defeated in Massachusetts. What do you make of that?
So we've actually talked to some folks in Massachusetts. There's been a pretty long kind of dissection of what happened there. I think what really happened is that the campaign that they had was built around the kind of personal contact and personal conversation that we actually saw with the gerrymandering conversation here. This is the kind of thing. I mean, all of you were willing to sit through 55 minutes of me blathering on about this. You can do it in 5, but it's really hard to do it in a 15-second commercial. And so, the conclusion that the Massachusetts folks have drawn as they think about going back is that they got wrong-footed by this pandemic, like a lot of us in a lot of ways. That this wasn't the only victim of the pandemic, and it wasn't, obviously the worst thing that happened because of the pandemic. There are lots of others, but that without a pandemic, I think it's a lot easier to imagine. It still wouldn't have been a landslide, but I think it's much more easy to conceive of this thing actually winning, because I think it does take some, like any good thing, it takes some personal persuasion. Anything else? Well, it is still a beautiful night out there, so I wish you all a lovely rest of the evening. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Kevin.
It is not for the faint of heart to listen to an hour of electoral minutia, but I am so glad that you did. And if there is any way that I can be of assistance on this, I would be glad to do it. I'm going to leave my information in the chat. Jason has done the same. And so feel free to get in touch with me. Feel free to get in touch with RankMIVote. Let me just drop it in. It's kevin@rankmyvote.com or .org. Either one works. And so if you're interested, let me know. And to the Berkley Library, there are a lot of folks like me at Wayne who are always looking to talk about various things, not always things that are on the ballot, but just stuff that we care about. So feel free to reach out if you're looking to fill some speaker spots or you want people to talk about various things. We're on it. We
absolutely
for a living. So let us know.
Yes, thank you.
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
All right, take care, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks, all of you. Appreciate it.
Bye-bye now.